I woke up on a hospital bed, believing my son would walk through the door at any moment. Instead, I found photos of him and his wife smiling in Europe while I lay alone, my phone silent, and my heart struggling to keep rhythm. That was the moment something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changed everything I thought I knew about family, trust, and the life I had spent decades building. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitaker, though everyone who knows me well calls me Maggie. I am 71 years old, and I have lived in the same modest brick house on the north side of Columbus, Ohio, for more than 35 years. When my husband Robert and I bought it in 1989, the maple tree in the front yard was no taller than the mailbox. Now its branches stretch over the roof, shading the porch where I drink my morning coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. I have been a widow for 8 years. Robert died of heart disease on a quiet November morning, and the silence he left behind settled into the corners of the house like dust. At first, I kept the television on all day just to hear voices, but over time I learned to live with the quiet. Some mornings, I still glance at his recliner in the living room, half expecting to see him folded into it with the newspaper spread across his lap. The house carries the story of our life together. The oak banister is smooth from decades of hands sliding along its curve. The kitchen table bears faint scratches from homework, science projects, and holiday baking. Every room holds a memory, and I move through them the way one moves through chapters of a book already read but never forgotten. For 30 years, I worked as an administrative secretary at Brookside High School. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady, and steady was what mattered. I typed transcripts, answered phones, and stayed late during enrollment season. In the summers, I supervised office hours and sorted filing cabinets while the hallways echoed with emptiness. Every extra hour meant another small deposit into the college fund for my son. Ethan is my only child. He is 45 now, broad-shouldered like his father, and the owner of a small construction company that keeps him busier than he admits. When he married Lori and they had children of their own, Sunday dinners at my house became our tradition. I still cook the same meals he loved as a boy: roast chicken, green beans with bacon, mashed potatoes whipped smooth with butter. The grandchildren race down the hallway, their laughter filling spaces that once felt too quiet to bear. I am not skilled with computers, and Ethan has taken care of my online bills for years. He set up automatic payments, insurance renewals, and property tax reminders. When envelopes arrive marked urgent, I set them aside for him. He explains what matters and what does not, and I sign where he points. It feels practical, a modern version of a son looking after his mother. Sometimes, my friends complain that their children moved away or rarely call. I listen politely and feel grateful. My son lives 20 minutes away. He checks in, he helps, he shows up. After Robert died, that constancy felt like proof that I had done something right. I have always believed that family is the net beneath the tightrope of life. As long as it holds, you can keep moving forward without fear. If you're still watching and you can feel the calm before everything changes, comment 1 below so I know you're here. Now, let's see what shattered that quiet life. The morning it happened began like any other early autumn day in Columbus, cool and pale with the kind of light that turns the maple leaves outside my kitchen window a soft, burnished gold. I had just poured coffee into my favorite blue mug and scattered seed along the back step for the sparrows. The house was quiet, except for the ticking wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. I remember feeling grateful for the calm. Then the room tilted. It began as a faint dizziness, the sensation that the floor had shifted beneath my feet. I reached for the counter, thinking I had stood up too quickly, but the weakness spread through my arms like water draining from them. The mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the tile. A tightness gripped my chest, not sharp, but heavy, as if someone had placed a stone beneath my ribs. I tried to call out, though there was no one to hear me, and the effort left me breathless. The last thing I remember before the floor rushed toward me was the smell of coffee and the sudden childish thought that I should not have let the mug break. When I opened my eyes again, voices hovered above me, layered and urgent. A paramedic knelt beside me, his gloved hand steady against my wrist, while another voice crackled through a radio. Cold air swept in through the open door. Someone asked me my name. I answered, though my tongue felt thick and unfamiliar. They lifted me onto a stretcher, the straps snug across my chest, and wheeled me past the maple tree whose branches flickered in the morning sun. The ambulance smelled faintly of antiseptic and rubber. Sirens wailed, then faded, then returned in waves. I watched the ceiling lights pass in rhythmic flashes and tried to steady my breathing. I told myself this was temporary, that bodies falter and recover, that I would be home by evening. At Ohio Health Riverside Methodist Hospital, the emergency department moved with efficient urgency. Bright lights glared overhead, and the air held the sterile scent of disinfectant. Nurses attached monitors, wrapped a cuff around my arm, and slid a thermometer beneath my tongue. A physician with calm eyes explained that my heart showed signs of strain and that dehydration may have contributed to the episode. They wanted to observe me overnight. Once the initial flurry subsided, the room grew still except for the soft beeping of machines. My purse sat on a chair beside the bed, and inside it, my phone waited like a tether to the outside world. I dialed Ethan's number with careful fingers. His voicemail answered. I left a message telling him I was in the hospital but stable and not to worry. I sent a brief text repeating the same. The afternoon passed in small interruptions. Blood pressure checks, medication, paperwork on a clipboard balanced across my knees. Each time footsteps sounded in the hallway, I turned toward the door, expecting to see my son's familiar frame. Hours slipped by. I imagined he was in a meeting or driving between job sites. He had always been dependable. There would be a reasonable explanation. In the bed beside mine, separated by a thin curtain, another patient received visitors who arrived in gentle waves. I heard laughter, the rustle of flowers being unwrapped, the soft murmur of a daughter adjusting pillows. Their voices filled the space with warmth that did not reach my side of the curtain. Near evening, a nurse paused while checking my vitals and asked if someone would be staying with me overnight. I hesitated before answering that my son would likely come later. She nodded, her expression kind but unreadable. As dusk settled beyond the narrow window, the room dimmed to a bluish gray. I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no replies. I folded my hands over the thin hospital blanket and listened to the steady rhythm of the monitor beside me. For the first time, a quiet question rose where certainty had always lived. Why had he not answered? If you're still with me and that hospital silence made you uneasy, comment 2 below. What happened next raised questions she never expected to ask. By the second morning, the hospital had settled into a rhythm that felt both predictable and strangely unreal. Vital checks arrived like clockwork. Medication cups appeared on plastic trays. The soft pulse of the heart monitor marked time more reliably than any wall clock. Physically, I felt steadier. The tightness in my chest had eased and my breathing came without effort. Emotionally, however, I felt suspended in a space where time moved, but nothing changed. My phone rested on the tray table beside the bed. Each time it vibrated in my imagination, my hand moved toward it, only to find the screen dark. There were no missed calls, no messages, no brief reassurance from Ethan. I told myself he might be driving between job sites, buried in paperwork, or trapped in one of the long meetings the contractors seemed to endure. He had always been dependable. There would be an explanation. The morning light stretched slowly across the floor, inching toward the foot of my bed. Breakfast came and went. A volunteer delivered a newspaper I did not read. In the hallway, carts rattled and voices murmured, reminders that the world continued beyond the thin walls of my room. Late that morning, a young nurse named Allison came in to check my vitals. She had a warm, open face and the efficient gentleness of someone accustomed to fragile people. As she wrapped the cuff around my arm, she asked whether my family had been by yet. I told her my son lived nearby and was likely busy with work. The words sounded reasonable, even to me. She hesitated before slipping her phone from her pocket. "I hope you do not mind," she said softly. "I think I may have seen your family online." She turned the screen toward me. The image showed Ethan standing beneath bright Italian sunlight, the ancient curve of the Colosseum rising behind him. Lori stood beside him in oversized sunglasses, one arm looped through his. The children beamed between them, their faces flushed with excitement. The sky above Rome was a deep, flawless blue. For a moment, I did not understand what I was seeing. The photo seemed disconnected from the hospital room, from the antiseptic smell and humming machines. Then I noticed the caption celebrating a long-awaited trip and the timestamp indicating it had been posted the previous day. I told myself the trip must have been planned months ago. I told myself Ethan might have believed I was stable. I told myself there were reasonable explanations. Allison scrolled gently. Another photo appeared, the children holding cones of bright gelato in a narrow cobblestone street. Another showed Lori seated at a cafe table beneath striped awnings. There were smiling selfies, ancient stone backdrops, and hashtags filled with celebration and gratitude. The dates aligned with the day I had been brought to the hospital. A quiet stillness settled inside me. I thought of the nights I had sat beside Ethan's bed when he was a boy, counting his breaths during fevers, willing his pain to ease. I thought of the way he used to reach for my hand in crowded places. Now I lay in a hospital bed 20 minutes from his home, unseen. "I am sorry," Allison said, lowering the phone. I realized she had been watching my face. "It is all right," I answered, though my voice felt distant to my own ears. When she left, the room seemed larger and emptier than before. I stared at my phone long after the screen dimmed to black. The cheerful images lingered in my mind, bright and sunlit, impossibly far from the muted gray of the hospital walls. I placed the phone face down on the blanket and folded my hands over it. No tears came. Instead, there was a numb stillness, as if something essential had shifted inside me without sound. I did not yet have a name for what I felt, but I understood with quiet certainty that something fundamental had changed. If you're still watching and that discovery shocked you, comment 3 below, because what she finds when she gets home will make things even harder to ignore. The morning I was discharged arrived with a stack of paperwork and a nurse carefully reviewing medication schedules I promised to follow. My body felt steadier, though a lingering weakness reminded me to move slowly. When the automatic doors of Ohio Health Riverside Methodist Hospital slid open and the October air touched my face, I felt both relief and an unexpected heaviness, as if something inside me had been left behind in that narrow hospital bed. A volunteer driver from a community service program brought me home. We spoke politely about the weather and traffic, but my attention remained fixed on the window, watching familiar streets pass by with a strange sense of distance. The maple trees were turning, their leaves drifting across sidewalks in copper and gold swirls. Everything looked exactly as it should, yet I felt as though I were returning to a place slightly altered. The first sign came when the car pulled into my driveway. Newspapers lay damp against the porch boards, their edges curled from morning dew. A small drift of leaves had gathered near the door, undisturbed. The mailbox sagged open, stuffed with envelopes. No one had come. Inside, the house greeted me with the stale air and a faint sour smell that tightened my throat. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the silence. On the kitchen floor, a faint discoloration marked where coffee had spread and dried after my fall. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, absorbing the stillness. The house felt familiar, yet it no longer felt tended. I moved slowly from room to room. The trash bin in the kitchen was full. The fern in the living room drooped toward the carpet, its soil dry and pale. Nothing suggested Ethan had stopped by, not even briefly. The realization did not strike like a blow. Instead, it settled slowly, like dust descending through quiet air. When I flipped the light switch in the hallway, the overhead fixture flickered before dimming to a weak glow. On the counter lay a notice stamped, "Final reminder," from the electric company. The balance was past due. I stared at the date, aware that the payment should have been automatic. I gathered the mail and carried it to the kitchen table, lowering myself into the chair Robert once favored at the head. Envelopes spread before me in uneven stacks: insurance updates, pharmacy notices, credit card statements, and utility warnings. I opened them carefully, as if the paper itself might reveal some simple misunderstanding. The credit card statement stopped my breath. Charges listed international airfare, hotel reservations, and restaurants with unfamiliar names. The dates aligned with the week I had been in the hospital. I traced the numbers with my finger, certain I had misread them. The total glared up at me in bold print. My name stood at the top of the page. Beneath those charges, another entry caught my eye: an electronic payment to Whitaker Construction Services. I did not recall approving any renovation work. For a moment, I wondered if Ethan had planned repairs as a surprise, but the amount was large enough that I felt I would have remembered such a conversation. I read the statement again, slower this time. My hands trembled, though the kitchen remained perfectly still. The clock ticked on the wall. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering over fallen leaves. I reached for the phone and called Dolores. My voice sounded steady as I asked if she could come over and help me look through some bills. She did not ask questions. She simply said she would be there soon. After I hung up, I sat alone at the table, the papers spread before me like pieces of a puzzle I did not want to solve. The house seemed larger than I remembered, its quiet pressing in around me. I studied the unfamiliar charges once more, a new fear forming beneath the surface of my thoughts. What else had I not seen? If you're still here, and the truth is starting to feel heavier, comment 4 below. Now let's uncover what the numbers were really hiding. Dolores arrived within 20 minutes, her gray sedan pulling into the driveway with the quiet certainty that had steadied me through countless moments of my life. She carried no purse, only her reading glasses and a canvas tote that seemed permanently filled with practical solutions. When she stepped into the kitchen and saw the spread of envelopes and statements across the table, she did not gasp or speculate. She simply took the chair beside me and began stacking the papers into neat piles. The simple rhythm of her movement steadied my breathing. She slid her glasses onto the bridge of her nose and lifted the credit card statement first. Her eyes moved slowly across the page, careful and deliberate. "These charges are from Italy. she said quietly, tracing the line items with one finger. Airfare, hotel reservations, restaurants. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. She continued reading, pausing at the dates. This was the week you were in the hospital. The words settled heavily in the room. I stared at the table's worn surface, remembering the sound of hospital machines and the glow of foreign sunlight in the photographs I had seen. Dolores turned the page. Were they authorized users on your account? Yes, I said, years ago, for convenience. She did not comment on that. Instead, she set the statement aside and picked up the notice from Whitaker Construction Services. What work was done? She asked. I do not know, I answered. I never approved anything. She studied the document and then suggested we check my email. I hesitated, embarrassed by how little I understood the account Ethan had set up for me years earlier. Dolores guided me through the password recovery process, her voice calm and steady. When the inbox finally opened, we found an electronic contract confirmation from 2 weeks earlier. My name appeared in typed script beneath a line indicating authorization. I stared at it, searching my memory for the moment I had agreed. Nothing surfaced. No conversation, no explanation, only a blank space where consent should have been. Dolores sat back, her expression tightening. This looks like an electronic signature. I never signed it, I said, the words emerging as a whisper. She nodded once, absorbing the implication without dramatics. Next, she suggested we review my bank accounts. I felt a tightening in my chest unrelated to my recent illness, but I followed her instructions. After another password reset, my checking and savings balances appeared on the screen. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Then Dolores clicked into the transaction history. A pattern emerged, monthly transfers to an external account, each in the same amount, each occurring on the first of the month. I watched the numbers accumulate backward through time, the total growing larger with every scroll. That is several $1,000s, Dolores said. The room tilted slightly, though I remained seated. I pressed my palms against the table to steady myself. This was not a missed payment or an oversight. It was systematic, quiet, and deliberate. Dolores placed her hand over mine. Breathe, she said softly. I did, drawing in slow air until the tightness eased. I cannot believe Ethan would do this, I murmured, even as the evidence glowed on the screen between us. She did not contradict me. Instead, she spoke carefully. What matters right now is protecting you. We need to understand exactly what has happened. The word protecting echoed in my mind, not accusing, not punishing, protecting. I looked around the kitchen where I had packed lunches, paid bills, and balanced a life built on modest means and steady trust. The idea that my financial footing might be slipping away felt more frightening than my recent collapse on the tile floor. Dolores gathered the statements into a single stack. You need legal advice, she said gently. Someone who can look at this objectively. I thought of Ethan as a boy, carefully counting coins from his allowance jar, determined to buy his own baseball glove. I thought of his hand in mine crossing busy streets. The memories rose instinctively, protective and warm. But the numbers on the screen remained. I nodded slowly. Tomorrow, I would call a lawyer. The morning after Dolores and I uncovered the transfers, I woke before dawn and lay still, listening to the unfamiliar weight of silence pressing against the walls. My body felt tired, but my thoughts were unusually sharp, as if some internal lens had shifted into focus. I moved carefully through my routine, making tea instead of coffee, gathering the statements and printed emails into a folder, and placing it beside my purse. Each document felt heavier than paper should. Dolores arrived at 9, and we drove downtown to an office building of glass and limestone that reflected the pale Ohio sky. The law office occupied a quiet suite on the 7th floor. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Framed certificates lined the walls, and shelves of legal volumes stood in orderly rows. The calm professionalism of the space steadied me in a way I had not expected. Daniel Harper greeted us with a firm handshake and a measured kindness that suggested long experience with difficult conversations. He listened without interruption as Dolores spread the documents across his desk. I explained my hospitalization, the credit card charges, the electronic contract, and the monthly transfers. Speaking the facts aloud made them feel both more real and strangely detached from me. When I finished, he folded his hands and regarded the papers for a moment. He said the pattern suggested unauthorized financial activity rather than simple oversight. He asked permission to review my credit records and property filings to determine whether any loans had been secured in my name. I signed the authorization forms with a hand that felt steadier than I expected. The days that followed stretched with quiet tension. I moved through the house as if walking through a museum of my own life, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. I ate little. Sleep came in brief intervals. Each ring of the telephone startled me, then faded into disappointment when it was not the call we awaited. 3 days later, Daniel's office phoned and asked us to return that afternoon. His tone over the line was controlled but urgent. I knew before we arrived that whatever he had discovered would change everything. He met us in the same office, but this time a thick folder lay centered on his desk. He opened it slowly and slid a document toward me. It was a home equity loan agreement secured against my property. My address appeared clearly at the top. Beneath the typed text sat a signature resembling mine. "I did not sign this," I said, the words leaving my mouth without hesitation. He placed another document beside it for comparison, my signature from a prior property filing. The differences were subtle but undeniable. He explained that the loan totaled approximately $120,000 and had been issued to Whitaker Construction Services. Payments had been missed. The account was now in default, and the lender had initiated preliminary foreclosure proceedings. The room seemed to narrow, the air thinning in my lungs. My house was not simply shelter, it was the record of a lifetime. Every sacrifice, every careful decision, every quiet evening after Robert's death had unfolded within its walls. The thought of losing it felt like losing the final proof that our life together had mattered. Daniel spoke gently, outlining the options. We could report the forgery and pursue fraud charges. We could contest the foreclosure with evidence. We could attempt negotiation. Or, to preserve remaining equity, I could sell the home before legal action advanced. Dolores rested her hand on my arm, grounding me in the present. I felt the tremor in my chest ease as a different realization emerged. Doing nothing would also be a decision. I asked what would happen if I sold the house myself. Daniel explained it could protect my financial future while the legal questions were addressed. The words settled into me with a quiet, irreversible clarity. When we left the office, the afternoon light seemed too bright for what I now carried. I knew my life had crossed an unseen threshold, and nothing ahead would resemble what I had left behind. If you're still watching and wondering what choice she could possibly make now, comment 6 below. Let's move on to Chapter 7, where everything begins to change. When I returned home after meeting with Daniel Harper, the house greeted me with a silence that no longer felt familiar. For decades, it had been a place of refuge, a structure that held the rhythm of our family's life. Now, I stood in the entryway with the unsettling awareness that these walls, once symbols of safety, had become a financial liability and a reminder of decisions made without my knowledge. I set the folder of documents on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic moving along the main road. The house had not changed. I had. That realization settled into me with a clarity that felt both painful and strangely steadying. The next morning, I called Daniel and told him to begin the steps necessary to prepare the house for sale. He spoke carefully about timelines and procedures, about protecting equity and preventing further legal risk. His tone remained professional, but I heard beneath it a quiet reassurance. Action meant protection. When I hung up the phone, I did not cry. Instead, I felt a calm resolve take root where uncertainty had lived. I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with different eyes. In the living room, the carpet showed a faint path worn by years of footsteps. The curtains, once chosen with excitement, had faded where the sunlight pressed against the fabric each afternoon. In the kitchen, the cabinets bore small chips near the handles from decades of use. For the first time, I saw the house not as a container of memories, but as a structure subject to time. Yet memory lingered in every corner. I paused beside the hallway wall where Ethan's height had been marked in pencil year after year. In the dining room, I could almost hear the overlapping conversations of holiday dinners and the sound of Robert's laughter echoing beneath the low light of the chandelier. The memories felt vivid but no longer protective. They belonged to a past that could not shield me from the present. 2 days later, the realtor arrived. She was efficient, kind, and gently direct, moving through each room with a clipboard and practiced eye. She spoke of square footage, market demand, and comparable sales in the neighborhood. I listened as my life was translated into measurements and resale value. It felt surreal, yet I understood the necessity. When I signed the listing paperwork, my hand trembled only slightly. The act felt less like surrender and more like self-preservation. I was not abandoning my past. I was protecting what remained of my future. Packing began that afternoon. I started with essentials, clothing, important documents, medications. Then I set aside the items that defined my life rather than simply filled space. Robert's watch, still polished from years of wear. Photo albums with softened corners. Letters tied in a ribbon from decades earlier. These I wrapped carefully and placed in a separate box. By evening, fatigue settled deep into my bones. The weight of decades revealed itself in every drawer and closet. I lowered myself into a chair and closed my eyes, overwhelmed not by regret, but by the sheer magnitude of a life lived in one place. Dolores arrived the next morning with cardboard boxes and the steady practicality that had always anchored me. A neighbor stopped by and offered to carry heavier items to the garage. Their quiet assistance reminded me that support does not always come from where one expects it. As dusk approached, I stood in the front doorway and looked back into the dim interior. The rooms rested in shadow, holding memories that would travel with me, whether I wished them to or not. I understood then that I was not leaving my life behind. I was carrying it forward, choosing which pieces to keep and which to release. The drive from Columbus to Asheville took most of the day, carrying me across stretches of highway that seemed to unwind the life I had known mile by mile. The flat Ohio landscape gradually gave way to rolling hills, then to rising slopes dusted with late autumn color. By the time the Blue Ridge Mountains appeared in the distance, layered in soft blue haze, I felt a quiet shift within me, as if the air itself had changed texture. Asheville greeted me with a slower rhythm than the city I had left behind. The streets curved instead of running in rigid lines. Local shops displayed hand-painted signs. People walked without hurry, pausing to speak with one another on sidewalks framed by early fall foliage. The town felt lived in rather than rushed through. My new home stood on a narrow lane just beyond the town center, a small wooden cottage set among tall pines and turning maples. It was modest, far smaller than the house I had sold, but sunlight spilled through the wide windows and pooled across the honey-colored floorboards. A porch stretched along the front, facing a distant ridgeline softened by morning mist. Inside, the rooms held only the essentials: a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom that opened toward the trees. When I set my suitcase down, the quiet felt different from the silence I had left behind. It did not press inward. It seemed to expand. I unpacked slowly, placing Robert's watch on the bedside table and setting a framed photograph of our younger selves on the mantel. I opened the windows and let the crisp mountain air move through the rooms, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For the first time in weeks, my breathing felt unrestrained. In the mornings, I carried coffee onto the porch and watched the fog lift from the valley below. The air tasted clean, and the sound of distant birds replaced the steady murmur of traffic. I walked along the narrow road, nodding to neighbors who greeted me without curiosity, as if I had always belonged there. Grief lingered, but it no longer pressed against my ribs. Peace existed beside it, tentative but real. One afternoon, as I arranged books on a small shelf, a knock sounded at the door. I assumed it was a delivery, or perhaps a neighbor introducing themselves. When I opened the door, Lori stood on the porch, her shoulders drawn tight beneath a light jacket. She looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes shadowed by fatigue. "I am sorry to arrive without calling," she said, her voice uneven. "I did not know how else to find you." The mountain air cooled against my skin as I stepped aside and let her in. She stood near the doorway, as if unsure she had permission to move farther. She told me she learned the full details of the loan only after the attorney contacted Ethan. She said she believed I had approved helping the business and had accepted his assurances without question. She admitted she had sensed something was wrong, but avoided confrontation, telling herself that financial stress would pass. Her voice faltered as she described mounting debts and pending lawsuits against the company. Pressure, she said, had narrowed Ethan's thinking until every decision became an attempt to outrun collapse. Silence and fear filled the spaces where honesty should have lived. I listened without interrupting, aware of anger moving beneath my ribs and sorrow rising beside it. I could see her exhaustion, her uncertainty about the life she had built, yet the harm remained, undeniable and permanent. "I cannot return to what was," I said quietly. "I need safety. I need to heal." She nodded, tears bright but contained. She asked if she could keep me connected to the children. I told her that I would not close that door. When she left, I stood on the porch and watched her car disappear along the winding road. The mountains held their quiet shape against the evening sky. The air felt steady, grounding, and vast. For the first time, I understood that distance could protect without erasing love. If you're still with me and feeling the weight of what was said at that door, comment 8 below. The final chapter reveals what healing really looks like. By the time the last leaves loosened from the maples and drifted across the narrow road in front of my cottage, I had begun to recognize the rhythm of my new life. Morning arrived softly in the mountains. Mist settled low in the valley before lifting to reveal ridgelines layered in muted blue. I carried my coffee onto the porch each day and watched the light gather slowly, as if the world were waking in careful stages. Routine formed without effort. After breakfast, I walked along the quiet lane where pine needles softened my steps and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. Neighbors passed with gentle nods and unhurried greetings. No one asked where I had come from or why I lived alone. Their acceptance felt natural, free of curiosity or judgment. A week after my arrival, I visited the small public library near the town square. The building was modest, with tall windows and shelves worn smooth by years of use. I asked about volunteer opportunities and soon found myself shelving books, guiding visitors toward the large print section, and helping a retired teacher locate local history records. The work was simple, but it gave shape to my days and restored a quiet sense of usefulness I had not realized I missed. Through the library, I met a small circle of women who gathered on Thursday afternoons for tea and conversation. They spoke openly about widowhood, relocation, illness, and the unexpected turns that arrive in later years. Their stories carried neither self-pity nor performance. Sitting among them, I felt companionship without obligation, a connection built on shared resilience rather than obligation or history. Sleep came more easily in the mountain air. The tightness that had once lived in my chest loosened, replaced by a steady calm. Grief remained, but it no longer overwhelmed me. It moved through my days like weather, present but not destructive. One afternoon, a letter arrived in an uneven child's hand. Inside was a drawing of mountains, a small house, and 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a wide yellow sun. A note written carefully in pencil told me that my granddaughter missed me and hoped I liked living near the mountains. I traced the crayon lines with my fingertip, feeling warmth rise where pain once lived. Love for the children remained simple and unbroken. Through Lori, I learned that Ethan's business had collapsed and that he was selling equipment to cover mounting debts. The news did not bring satisfaction. Instead, I felt a quiet stillness, an acceptance that consequences arrive whether we wish them to or not. That evening, I placed the drawing on the mantel beside Robert's photograph. The small cottage glowed with the lamplight as dust settled over the ridgeline. Wrapped in a blanket on the porch, I watched the sky deepen from pale blue to indigo. For the first time in many years, I realized I was no longer waiting for my old life to return. Winter arrived quietly in Asheville. One morning, I stepped onto the porch and found a thin lace of frost along the railing. The mountains beyond washed in pale silver light. I wrapped my hands around a mug of tea and breathed in the cold air, surprised by how steady my lungs felt. Months earlier, in a hospital bed far from here, I had wondered whether my body and my life would ever feel stable again. Now both seemed anchored in a calm I had not known for years. I think often about what I survived. The medical crisis was frightening, but the deeper wound came from the silence that followed, from realizing how easily I could be set aside. I lost a house filled with memories, a sense of financial security, and the certainty I once felt about my son. Yet in that loss, I discovered something unexpected: clarity. I learned that trust without boundaries leaves the door open to harm, and that protecting oneself is not an act of cruelty but of self-respect. I no longer see Ethan only as the boy I raised or the man who betrayed my trust. I see a human being shaped by fear and poor choices. Compassion does not require that I step back into harm's reach. Distance, I have learned, can be an act of wisdom. The letters from my grandchildren rest in a small wooden box beside Robert's photograph. Their drawings of mountains and bright suns remind me that love can continue across distance, unbroken by the failures of adults. I am more than a widow, more than a mother. I am a woman with a voice, with choices, with years still my own. Each morning, I write a few lines in my journal, marking the quiet intention to live deliberately. The mountains stand unchanged beyond my porch, steady and enduring. I sit in their shadow and feel neither abandoned nor alone. I have released what I could not keep and carried forward what matters. I am not who I was. I am who I chose to become. In the end, life has a quiet way of stripping away the illusions we once depended on and revealing what truly sustains us. Loss can arrive disguised as betrayal, change can feel like exile, and silence can echo louder than any words. Yet within those moments of fracture lies an unexpected invitation to rediscover dignity, to reclaim personal boundaries, and to choose peace over resentment. Starting over is never easy, especially when it means releasing what once defined us. But renewal begins the moment we stop measuring our worth by what we have lost and start honoring what remains within us. Healing is not a single decision, but a series of small, brave choices made each day. And sometimes, the most powerful act of love is learning to protect your own spirit while still leaving room for compassion. If this story resonated with you, thank you for being here. Share your thoughts in the comments and follow the channel for more stories that remind us we are never alone.